Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
So tonight we are talking about memoir and how do you craft a story that is true? And is it the same thing as crafting a story that is not true? And if you're going to tell a story that is true, how do you tell it? How much of it do you tell, and what voice do you tell it, and how do you get somebody to read it? We're going to cover all that stuff tonight, so let's just get to it. I'm going to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Katherine Catmull. She is the author of 3 books, most recently the YA novel The Radiant Road. Her first book, Summer and Bird, was named one of Booklist's 2012 Top 10 First Novels for Youth. She is one of the 4 co-authors of The Cabinet of Curiosities, which was named one of the New York Public Library's best books of 2014. Besides her decades as a stage actor in Austin, she also does voice acting for games like DC Universe Online and Wizard 101. She's written numerous short plays, and she has worked with people as a freelance editor on their memoirs. Please welcome Katherine Catmull. Jonathan Wei is a writer, director, and producer. His work has appeared in The Village Voice, the Iowa Review, the North American Review, Glimmer Train, and other publications, and he is a past fellow of the Vermont Studio Center and the Atlantic Center for the Arts. Jonathan's work has been staged at the Guthrie Theater, the Library of Congress, the Maryland Theater, Center for the Performing Arts, and others, and featured by the New York Times, Washington Post, Huffington Post, MSNBC, NPR, and others. And by others, it just means everywhere. Jonathan founded the Telling Project in 2008 and continues to serve as executive director. Please welcome Jonathan. And Rachel Starnes is the author of the critically acclaimed memoir, The War at Home, A Wife's Search for Peace and Other Missions Impossible. She received her MFA in creative nonfiction from California State University, Fresno, and her BA from the University of Texas. Her essays have appeared in the Colorado Review, Front Porch Journal, and O Magazine. Born in Austin, Texas, she has lived in Scotland, Texas, Saudi Arabia, Florida, California, and Nevada, and is currently on the move again with her husband, 2 sons, and a puppy. Please welcome Rachel. Just sort of a general question to get started, and that's it. So we're talking about memoir, which is like a distinct form in that it's published either through like a book or an essay or in a story, like a sort of professionally produced story. And it's different than a story that we just sit around telling each other. But the differences are a little fuzzy, right? Like what distinguishes just the stories that we tell every day of our lives, some of which are amazing, right? That's often how we become writers, is by listening to aunts and uncles over the dinner table telling stories and feeling compelled to tell our own. But then what raises those stories to the level of something that's sort of public? I guess we'll start on the other end of the table. Rachel, because you nodded, I'll start with you first.
I'll stop doing that.
What is there a kind of, is it just a matter of craft? Is there a kind of intention? Is there something to it that raises an essay, story, memoir beyond the level of stuff we tell every day?
I think what raises a story to the level of something that you want to then tell publicly is the level of what you don't know around it. I think that's where it becomes something universal sometimes. And I also think that what's compelling about a story is not necessarily one that's successful and easy to tell and where you know where the laughs are going to be or anything like that. I think often these are the ones that we start off not wanting to tell and actively spending years hiding or running from or wishing they weren't true. Or at least that was my experience. And I also think that the process of writing the memoir is also, it's a looping process. It's not always one where, and I know you have a question that deals a little bit more with this, but it's not always one where this is a story where you've descended into the depths and you've risen up to the mountain, and now you know how to tell it, and you have like the kernel of wisdom that you're now going to share. Because number one, I think in starting to write that kind of story, you're often confounded. The thing that you thought you were going to share that was going to be the takeaway from that moment ends up being something else, or you get lost on the way to it. I think the best stories to tell publicly are the ones where there's a little bit of blood, sweat, and tears on the page, and that you're still trying to hash it out. And part of telling it in a larger setting is almost reaching out to whoever's going to read it with a question of, have you ever felt this, and can you help me figure this out? Those are the ones, to me, that are very arresting and that really take hold of you. If anybody's read Tara Westover's Educated, that one kind of reached out and grabbed me like that. Like, there's a lot that's not resolved there, and that still is alive on the page. And I think those are the ones that are really arresting in that way.
And like, so the title of your memoir sort of suggests that it's not going to be the sort of traditional sort of like 3-act arc. Because I mean, it's the subtitle is A Wife's Search for Peace and Other Missions Impossible. It's not a bear came into my house and I had to wrestle it and kill it, and wow, that was amazing. I'm going to tell you the story of that one moment. It's
That
not.
would be
It's
an awesome
that
story.
would be an awesome story. But like, we never have stories that like happen to us like that, or we very rarely do. Or that's a story that lasts that long, right? I killed the bear. At what point did you know that in writing about your experience that it was a thing? It was like a singular thing that would be in a book, and not just a bunch of stuff that you've been writing.
I think for me, that was really the moment where I was connecting to the fact that it was kind of the same story happening over and over. It was a loop that I was caught in. So just context in a nutshell around that. I grew up, my father was worked on offshore oil rigs, and so he did shift work and was gone a lot. And that was always strange to me. I grew up in Austin, but I didn't grow up in an environment where many of the other dads did what my dad did, and so it was hard to understand, I think, for a lot of my friends, why one time we're a 3-person family and then one time we're a 4-person family. It happens over and over. So I took away from my childhood, right, never marry a man who leaves. And so then I married a dude in the Navy. And I think it was really coming to that, I don't think I knew that it was ever going to be a book, except that I kept circling around and around this idea of, why do I keep ending up here? Why do I keep ending up in this place that hurts the way that things always used to hurt?
Jonathan, what about you? So you write and you also organize a storytelling series. And I wonder, when you're thinking about your own work, or when you're helping people, think about their work in order to tell it on the stage, what begins to separate, like, how do you help people think of their own work as like a thing that I'm going to publicly display?
I help them much more coherently than I'm able to help myself, that's for certain. It's a very different process from the inside than it is from the outside. But there are a lot of different components to it, and Rachel was talking about some of them, about how you move through the material and how you move through your memories, and how then at some point you have to figure out a way of organizing them. And I think that one of the things about memoir that makes it a form is that it is either a collection or it is a singular memory, depending on how long you're working and what kind of a piece you're working on. But there's some kind of a theme. There's some kind of a meta notion that you're trying, and Rachel, I think, articulated it fairly well in terms of the work that she has presented, which is, how did she end up in this place again? And that's a sort of guiding question. And that's the difference between, to go back to your original question, in one sense, that's the difference between a story, which may have that, but probably is highly reliant on the context in which it's being told, the people that you're with, and how you're telling it verbally. And then a memoir, which is actually a piece which has some kind of internal mechanism that is drawing the reader through, that's not necessarily explicitly this event or this event or this event, but it's in fact a sum of the events. So it generates its own context in some ways. It generates its own sensibility. When I'm working with people's stories, it's interesting. Because we work in a performance form, we approach it in a variety of different ways, and we approach it as initially we'll interview someone who's interested in performing with us, and we'll do an extensive interview with them about their experience in the military. We work with military folks, and record it, and that's really the first part of the process, is them just talking to us about their experiences and us asking questions. We then have that recording and we transcribe it, and that's the second part of the process, and that's our part of the process, where we refamiliarize ourselves with the material and we see it on the page, and we see it as something that we can pull into a more structured kind of piece. And then we hand it back to that person. They go through it on the page and they say, this works, this doesn't work, this is right, this is not right, this is what I wanted to talk about, and this isn't what I wanted to talk about. And we work with them until they get to a point where they're satisfied with it. And then they actually transition into performance. And performance is a whole different editing process. And that's actually something that I think you probably are familiar with as an actress. When you embody something, when you start putting it in your body, moving around with it and speaking it, it's a really powerful memory trigger. And it's one of the things that we actually ask people to do when we give them back the initial draft of the script. Read it to yourself alone, sitting. Then stand up and read it to yourself walking around. Then read it out loud to somebody that you trust. Then read it out loud moving around to somebody that you trust. If you can do it, go back to some of these places that some of these experiences happened to you and read it there as well. And what will happen is that you'll start to build layers into those memories, and you'll start to build that structure. So there's a bunch of different answers to your question, but there are a lot of different ways that you can use to both structure and to access memory, in terms of not just working with what you're thinking about and putting it on the page, but you are your vehicle, you're your resource. And so you can actually exploit yourself in a variety of different ways in coming to terms with whatever these things are that you're interested in writing about.
You mentioned audience. You say the story changes based on the audience. And since you're working with military folks, when you're working with military folks, military is something that, like, when you're telling stories within that group, there's lingo that only they understand. There's a way of talking about stuff that is common to them that might not be common to, like, people who are not in the military. And so when you take people who are used to perhaps telling those stories within that context and you take them out of that context, what does that do to the way they tell the story?
We encourage them not to change their language much, but they're going to inevitably. I mean, most of the people who are in the military, and you'll know about this as well, Rachel, they're really good at code switching. I mean, you have to exist in several worlds if you're going to be in the military. You have to be able to exist in the civilian world, and then you're going to be existing within the military, and you're going to be existing within the different kinds of units and branches of service that you're in, and they all are very different. It's basically you're exercising cross-cultural communication all the time. So some of these folks will do this automatically without thinking about it when they initially even talk to us, and then on stage. But they'll also develop a language among themselves, so they never go on stage alone. They'll always go on a stage with a cast of 6 or 7 other people. And so they'll all develop a lingo. And in fact, almost every production that we've had, there are just a bunch of catchphrases that work their way into the script through the performance process, through the rehearsal process, because they all get to know each other and they develop a colloquialism, basically a lingua franca among them. And we actually encourage that because we feel like that's actually fairly authentic when it comes to the way in which the military operates and should be perceived. It's its own culture, and part of being introduced to it and part of understanding it is allowing that culture to happen. So that's, that's again, a somewhat tangential answer, but yeah, we don't discourage that they translate. And I actually think that there's great power in a language that takes a little while to understand. One of my favorite references in thinking about this is Miller's Crossing, which is one of the Coen brothers' early movies, but you can't understand a thing for like the first 45 minutes of the movie. But it's a brilliant movie. And once you do begin to understand what the language is, you're suddenly immersed in another culture. It's much more than just watching a performance. At that point, you've crossed over into actually your brain biochemically is working differently.
So, Katherine, since Jonathan was talking about language, I'm going to move to you because the class that you've taught is about like the language of memoir. And when you and I met months ago, we were talking about that class. You used the metaphor of a ghost story, which is it's both like a fictional form and a memoir form too. Because if you like ask even this room, how many of you have seen a ghost? What's your ghost story? I mean, hands will go up. Yeah. So what connection does the language of a ghost story and the way that we tell them have with the ways that like we write memoirs?
Well, I use the ghost story example because I think it's one that people can understand right away, in that a ghost story is kind of you were talking about embodiment. I mean, all writing, you want your writing to speak to your own body. Like, it's very useful if you're really in your own body when you're writing and back in that place that you're writing about. But you also want to put your reader in their body because that's what engages a reader. When your reader's body buys in that this is real, like they can smell things and see things and hear things, okay, so this is really happening, that's when people start crying or laughing or get scared, your heart beats fast. That embodiment is really important. But sometimes when you're writing a memoir, or anything really, but a memoir, and it felt so big and vivid in your heart and in your mind, but on the page it feels really flat. A lot of times that's because you're telling it in summary instead of in scene. And a summary, and so the way I explain this to people I'm working with is to tell a ghost story in summary would be to say, I knew this girl whose sister was coming home from college, and she pulled over to a gas station, and she thought the attendant was like a psycho she'd heard about on the radio, but it turned out the psycho was in her back seat, so she got rescued, luckily. That's like, that is not, if I told that at the campfire, everybody'd be so disappointed. That's the least scary ghost story. But if you started out with, this girl was driving down this dark road, and it was like in the woods in the country, and it was raining really hard, so it was like slap of the windshield, and the radio, because of the trees, was going in and out, and you just hear this fuzz, static, and then a voice saying, a psychotic killer psycho has escaped from the whatever. You get the idea. That's like starting to bring you in. It's starting to bring your body into the story. So yeah, that's my ghost story spiel. A lot of it comes from acting, I will say. The way that they teach actors to have emotions on stage, if you need to be sad, for example, is to think about something, in your life that made you sad. But if I just think about, oh yeah, that time my cat died, I'm not feeling anything. But if I really sit and think about, it was a November afternoon, and the vet came to our house, and that kind of cold light was slanting through the window, and she was laying in my lap, and her little chest was going up really fast, little black fur, and the vet took this really cold, anyway, you get the idea. Now I'm starting to make myself sad. So anyway, yeah, it's an acting technique really, but it works exactly the same way in writing, I think.
When somebody's sitting down to like either write a true story or to tell it, it can be tricky to figure out where to start. And even for like the professionals, it's hard. Like you'll see like biopics, like movies about people's real lives, and it's like they were born here, and it takes them all the way to like when they die, and those are the ones to me anyway. Those feel like badly done because there's no narrative arc. There's just like their consciousness, and when they're not conscious, then the movie's over. And memoirs don't usually do that. Memoirs tend to have like a more defined structure. Is there a kind of general rule or any way that people can like sort of like a thing to rely on to figure out where does the story start? Everybody looks up. Rachel, what do you think?
I'm trying to remember the process of how I discovered where my book should start, because I think it was fairly late in the process. I think I had quite a few pages and structure in and had tried to start it in a number of different places. And what I eventually came to was the decision to start it the morning of dropping off my husband for a deployment. And just that kind of the quick anticlimactic, how we had agreed we weren't going to do a big goodbye. We had agreed it was basically going to be like, I'm going to drive you to the hangar and tuck and roll. Like, that's it. I'm peeling out. And then what I did directly after that was avoid the house and drive to Target in another town and wander the aisles. And eventually I bought pink satin sheets, which Target pink satin sheets. Yeah. But it solved the problem of realizing that I wouldn't have to wake up the next morning in the same bed, still smelling like him, and have that awful 2 or 3 seconds where you reach for someone and they're not there. Because if you're laying on cheap pink satin, there's no way in hell he's going to be there anyway. You know, like, he would not get near that. So, and for me, that ended up being a convenient entry point because it was me caught in the loop again, you know, the very familiar loop of here you are, here's all your bags, you've been spending however long, you know, several weeks now packing these things. It feels like you're already gone, you're checking out, and I hate that feeling. I hate being in that space. And so it was me in that space again, but trying to do something different with it. So it was the beginning of the loop, the beginning of the stuckness, and trying to develop some sort of coping mechanism in that. And I like a lot what, and I've read about this too, like other writers, you know, where do you start the story? And I really like the idea, I believe I read it from Mary Carr, that it was like, you want to throw them in just a little bit to, you know, a dramatic moment with a lot of questions around it, so that immediately there, you kind of have some hooks. Why is this happening? Why is that happening? What does this mean? What does that mean? But then it starts fast and then allows you in the very next chapter to kind of slow down a bit and give a little bit more of the context. So it begins kind of with a bang with a lot of questions and a little bit disorienting, and then the very next step, I find it works well to kind of step back and give a little bit of explanation. So.
Jonathan, when you're helping people in the stories that they tell, what do you tell them in terms of where they start? And also, because, especially since it's a shorter form, it's not an entire memoir, it's maybe a 10-minute story. What's so important is also giving the context necessary for the story, because the story is never just like a series of actions. And you know, if it's a New Yorker essay, almost every New Yorker essay has the same structure, which it's like the first couple paragraphs are like, here's the thing that's happening, here's the story, space break, and then he grew up in Cambridge, and then so on. Do you sort of like have them model that kind of structure? How do you both tell them where to start and how to work in the stuff that isn't part of the immediate action of the story?
It's a good question. I'm not sure that I have a particular method. We have a structure.
What is that structure?
We employ a 3-act structure basically, and the first act is based on questions about how this individual got involved with the military and basic training, what their first experiences with the military were like. And as you were speaking, Rachel, I was thinking about, you know, how we do this and what is universal about it and yet at the same time distinctive, because they're all distinctive. The stories are very distinctive. And I think that one of the things that happens for us is that we ask really big questions. we really will start the interview with, so how'd you get into the military? And if you have 10 people who are in the military in front of you and you ask them that question, you're going to get 10 completely different answers. Some of them are going to be historical. Some of them are going to be describing going to the recruitment center. Some of them are going to be talking about their parents and their grandparents. So it's really like they're going to start establishing their own context. And I do think actually, having done this for a while now, there's something really compelling about the 3-act structure. I mean, it really does work. Like, it works. It's not that it's the only structure out there, but it's a pretty reliable workhorse, and it will do a lot. And it really, you can hang a lot of different kind of information. You can do a lot of different kinds of things narratively with it. And basically, it's you want the first 10 to 20% of the piece to be establishing context in one way or another, whether that's going to Target and buying sheets, or whether that's giving a historical overview of your family in the military. And then you want the next, whatever, I'm not good with numbers, so 50 to 60% of it, something like that, or 60 to 70% of it, to be, the real meat of the narrative, the things that happened that were important. And then you want the last 10% to be kind of like, this is how I ended up, or this is how it ended up. And you can do a ton with that. And that's just, I think that if there's anything that I would bring to this, and I think it's limited in terms of, the experience that sits on either side of me, but, there's some simple structures that can be super, super helpful when you're trying to make these decisions. And that's one of them. Just think about it as 3 pieces and see which pieces fit in terms of percentage, in terms of the information that they're giving to your potential reader.
As long as we're talking about sort of the early parts of storytelling, like figuring out what the frame is and so on, I think we should acknowledge that sometimes it's not always easy to know whether the story should be told as a true story or as fiction. And Katherine, you mentioned, we talked about ghost stories. And that's an example of how like truth and fiction sometimes are sort of like right alongside each other. And even, a lot of story, and I think sometimes people fall into telling fiction because they can't make their true story feel the way that it felt to them, so they have to add different elements. And I wonder, since you've written 2 novels and screenplays, and I wonder, is there a kind of like tipping point that tips you this way or that way in terms of like, this is going to be a novel, and when you're working with people, if they have this question, like, is it a novel? Is it a memoir? How do you figure that out?
Yeah, it hasn't been a big question for me because of just my tendencies to write novels, anyways, to write more magic realism or fantasy kind of thing. But when I work with people, it's a big question. A lot of people have that question. I think if your impulse was to write it as a memoir, that you should write it as a memoir and not worry, while you're writing it at least, not worry at all about what your mom's going to think or your sister's going to think, which I understand is a concern, but you can't have that concern while you're writing. I think Mary Carr says, you should just, it's your story. If they want to have their story told, they should write their own memoirs. Advise them. I actually just did a manuscript critique of a guy who had written his story like 2 ways, one as a memoir and one as he was trying to make it kind of YA fiction, and it's tough. I think in some ways he was trying to escape having the feelings attached to that time in his life. And, but I was saying, it's okay if you want to write it as YA fiction, but he's still got to have some feelings. You can give him different feelings if you want, but that's going to be hard. Why don't you just write it as a memoir, man? I guess I would interrogate your own reasons for wanting to write it as fiction and make sure that's because it will be a better story, or you can do something more interesting with it, and that it's not because you're afraid of what other people will say, but most of all, that it's not that you're afraid that you'll have to confront some things that you don't want to confront. Like, that's where all the juice and gold is, as she was saying. That's everything. So follow that. Don't resist it. Follow those threads.
Let's stick with that for just a moment, because often it's apparent to other people where that juice and gold is in our stories, and it's not always apparent to us. When you're working with a manuscript like that, how do you get people to sort of dive into that, and how do you, because it's scary, right? And then there's some risk in doing that and putting it on the page, even if nobody ever reads it, because you have to sort of confront it yourself.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I do calls with clients, and I'll actually use some kind of like Gestalt techniques, which is really just to try to drop them into their body again. I mean, it comes back to that again, and drop them back into that place. Or there's I brought it with me. There's a great book by Linda Berry called What It Is, which is about writing, and it's about it's about going inside the image. I did an exercise from it in this, and I probably will again in that online course, and it was, oh my gosh, the stuff people came up with doing this exercise was so powerful. And all it was car. You make a list of cars, and then she has some questions, and then eventually, after you've entered all the questions, you write something about this car. And people were just reading these very powerful things about being in their dad's yellow convertible with his new wife, and he bought a yellow convertible, and just their hands going up and down on the air, and eyes boring into the back of his head. I mean, I'm not telling it well, but it was quite powerful. So now I forgot what was your question? Was I answering it correctly?
Oh yeah, just like strategies for like working your way into stuff that maybe you, out of sort of self-preservation, want to not,
right.
you want to avoid.
Yeah, I'm dropping into the image, as Linda Berry calls it, or dropping into your body. I mean, and sometimes free writing really helps with that. Free writing, that kind of writing, what's her name? Writing down the bones. Yes. That can really help, when you just start out for the first few minutes being, this is stupid, I don't have anything to say, I hate this, I hate the person who suggested it, I hate writing down the bones. I mean, that's how mine always start when I do it. And then after a while, you just start writing like things you remember, and like the more concrete you can get, the more like every bit of sense you can get, the more you get sucked into that place. And you do start to re-experience your feelings, and it's really powerful. And I wanted to throw in really quickly about how to know where to start it. There's a playwright who's a guy who teaches playwriting, whose name I have forgotten, but he always says you should ask the Passover question: why is tonight different from all other nights? And like your example is a great one of that. Like, this time it's different. I'm going to make it different this time. I'm going to buy pink satin sheets and break the cycle. Anyway.
Well, that's an example where memoir and fiction are exactly the same, because so much fiction is born out of like the broken routine.
Yes.
Every day was the same, and then this day was different.
Yeah, stranger came to town.
Right.
I went on a journey. Yeah.
But speaking of novels, so Rachel, one of the classes you've taught for us in the past is about structure, and one of the things I think people run into when they're writing a memoir, especially like a longer length work, is they try to use like the hero's journey, or one of the sort of like the structure that we learned in high school about like what plot looks like. And they realize like their life doesn't look like that. They don't have like that moment of culmination where everything, like they don't get to like stand at the top of Mount Doom and be like, we did it, and then get rescued by the eagle. So when people realize that, then it throws the entire structure into like chaos, right? Because then like what sort of like pulls the story along? Like, what have you found in terms of like how, like what kinds of structures can then replace that hero's journey?
So I'm continually discovering new ones that I think are helpful, and it all really started, I think, with trying to put my own book together and being told that, I needed to break this down on note cards and put it up on the wall and start moving things around physically. And that was great feedback, but it was also like in TV shows where they want to like show you quickly that someone's absolutely bonkers. Like they show you their obsession wall, where it's like people's eyes are X'd out and there's thread and all that kind of stuff. So it started to look like that. But what was helpful about that was that I started to notice movement. I mean, it felt almost like composing, like a musical piece. I could see motifs, and they did not look like rising action, climax, falling action, denouement. It didn't look like that. It looked like here's this parallel line, and there's almost this accompanying motif about here's where the music was familiar from when I was growing up. And that helped me tell a more syncopated story, where it's like there's a chapter from the present action that's going on, and then there's a chapter from this is how it played out in childhood, and then there's a chapter present action and played out in childhood. And that really allowed me to weave back and forth a lot more, and I found that helpful because it didn't put the pressure on me towards the end that there was going to be like some moment that would carry the most weight. I think that did end up happening structurally. There's a fairly late into the process of writing the book, I witnessed an event that I didn't see any possibility of writing around it. I either had to end the book right then before I had seen this happen, or I had to somehow include it. And that felt almost impossible to do. I saw a jet crash, and I saw a person die, and that felt like, if you're going to put this in here, it can't be like, and here's the money shot of the book, like you had to hold that very carefully and figure out where to put that structurally so that it didn't feel like it was going to be that arc and fall and resolution, because honestly that happened and there was no resolution for me after that. There was nothing that got more comfortable or easier. If anything, it raised the stakes by an order of magnitude, and it unsettled everything. In fact, I think it pointed out to me that my true fear from being a kid was that my father wasn't going to come back from work. And so I think structurally, as far as that goes, every story is different. And I think the allowing yourself to believe that and allowing yourself to actually move your story physically around and think about metaphors other than the one cultural story that's been shoved down our throats for years seriously, I also think it's helpful to think about the hero's journey and really ask yourself, where have I seen this before? Why does this feel so natural to a story? Well, it's because it's selling a point of view. It's selling an idea about how we learn and how we incorporate these things. And I would argue that we learn, but we keep making the same mistakes. And that's not bad. That doesn't mean that your story's over, or you don't have anything important to say. If anything, it means tell it louder, So I don't know. I think as far as structure goes, there's any number of ones that work beautifully visually, but to me it was really powerful to break it down into that step of having pieces on a wall looking crazy for a couple of months so that I could see that piece of it.
When you do that, I'm curious what that looks like on the page in terms of, because it's not going to go from it's not going to literally go from place to place to place down the road if it's a journey. If it's going to be the same thing happening over and over again, it can't just be literally the same thing happening over and over again, because then the reader gets bored.
Yeah.
How do you sort of show the sort of same thing happening over and over again, or sort of as in music, show different themes popping up over and over again, and yet keep that forward momentum that a story needs to have?
I think you give it a frame. So the frame for me ended up being, my husband's career in the Navy up to the point where it was time to make a decision to get in or get out, or to stay in, take a re-enlistment bonus, stay in for a long haul, or get out. And the lovely part about that is just timeline-wise, I burned out before we made that decision. So I got to write the anti-ending ending, where it was like, there's no decision yet. Here's how it feels to live with uncertainty. Boom, I'm out. So that was lovely. But I think the structure of that, a military career is very structured, and it is a building and an accretion of rank and status. And so it was lovely. I was able to show that in the building process of him as a pilot, what that looked like. and also at the same time show how every successive relocation and move erased me over and over and over, and I always started over. So thematically it worked beautifully too, I think, to just put the frame on it of here's how you build a pilot, and then they get to this point where they have to make a decision, and then you leave it open.
It sounds like sometimes that frame is like there are multiple like story arcs going on. Like your husband's and your arc are not the same arc.
Definitely.
Jonathan, like even thinking about how to end a story, especially, many stories are like this, but certainly military stories are not like, and then I came home and boy, glad that was behind me, all done. Most famous like stories about war are not like that at all. And so you mentioned like the third part of the story that people tell, which is like what's going on now. But I wonder how people tend to approach that, because as Rachel was saying, like what's going on now is not necessarily like a boom done moment. It's like a kind of ongoing thing. How do people wrap it up?
It's highly individualized. We, like I said, we have this 3-act thing that we do, and we break up basically a military career into, basic training, and entrance to the military and basic training, and then duty stations and deployments, and then transition back to, quote unquote, the real world, separating from the military and transitioning back to real life, which some people who we've worked with haven't done yet. They're still in the process, or they're still in the military. The way that their lives break down into those 3 acts are very idiosyncratic. We have some people who the vast majority of what they talk about happens before they actually end up going for a duty station. And in fact, some people we've worked with, they never made it past basic training. They had some kind of, something happened, and that's what their story is about. And then we have a lot of people who we've worked with for whom those first 2 acts they're minimized, and what they're really wanting to talk about is what happened after they left the military. That's the significant part of their career. So it's not necessarily, I'm not a big fan of conclusive endings. That's just me. There are a lot of people who we work with, they are able to tie up their experiences with a bow. I see that as a function of who they are, essentially. That's how they see themselves. That's how they see the world. And then there are some people who are, they're still completely raw and completely unresolved. And that's, again, part of who they are, and an expression of their story. So we don't necessarily guide people in any particular direction. The one of the fixed pieces that we do in every performance we do is, at the very end of the performance, every individual on stage introduces themselves by name and steps forward to the front of the stage. I'm not sure if that's necessarily helpful, but it does seem like that's kind of what Memoir is aiming towards at some level. So you're trying to introduce yourself to whomever is your audience. And that's, ultimately that's the goal of the work that we do is to start a conversation between these folks and their communities so that they can understand one another a little bit better across what is a cultural divide. But that's, I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, or I have any helpful answers. Well, I think that at some level that's the way that we work with it, is that, some people, the end of their story is the vast majority of their story. You have 8 minutes on stage, 6 minutes of it are spent talking about what happened in the last year, and it's completely unresolved.
I am curious, it could be in your own work or in the work that happens on stage. Like you have to have like a last line, right? You can't and you sometimes, and especially if you go to like live storytelling events, you'll see this where they're like, and I'm just gonna, they just sort of like back off. And you'll sometimes see people who are like, I wish you would stop talking now. Like you need the old sort of vaudeville hook to get them off stage. When there isn't that sort of bow wrapping moment, right? This is what it all amounts to, the fable ending. How do you find that last line? Is it a matter of finding something like that Katherine was talking about, that sort of focuses on a particular image Is it a matter of sort of like finding some kind of summary line? Like, how do people like just find the words to stop talking?
I mean, it's always going to be one person out of several. So we have several different people's endings to choose from, which is good. I mean, it makes it a little bit easier. But it really is. I mean, you can do it in any number of different ways. You can wrap it up. There are some people who do that beautifully, and you want to have that at the end of the piece, and it works. And then sometimes it's just, it's just something that's haunting and lingering and mysterious, or horrifying or wonderful or wondrous. I mean, you can really work with endings in an infinite number of ways. But my own personal tendency, I like endings that are explosive, not necessarily in a dramatic fashion, but ways that rather than narrowing the perspective of what's gone before, you end on something like an image, and the image opens everything up, and it leaves the reader in this space in which the reader has to then orient him or herself. And I like that. That's my preference. But we've worked with at this point 300 people, and so we don't always get our preferences. So.
Right.
And that's another thing too. Sometimes a work demands something that is not necessarily your own predisposition. So.
And especially if the image addresses the motifs that you were talking about that have been going through, then it can act like a resolving chord. You know what I mean? That pulls all the music from before and gives it like a kind of resolution, which is not necessarily a story resolution, but a musical resolution or an imagistic resolution. That can be quite powerful.
It helps if you know your title, too.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah.
A lot of my book was written without a title, and I think when I finally knew what the title was going to be, which, by the way, someone else had to step in and help me with that because I came up with 55 options that were all terrible. But when I finally knew what my title was going to be, that really helped with figuring out that last sentence.
That's great.
Katherine, in terms of like ending, there's also like the point in which you say, I'm going to stop working on this manuscript. It's done.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's hard for any manuscript. I would imagine it's maybe particularly hard for memoir because you always feel like you can like convey the material better.
Yeah.
Or your sense of it changes, right? Because as you think about it, like the story is not the same in your own head as it was when you first started working on the manuscript. How do you tell people, okay, how do you figure out when that moment is where like they're gonna just walk away from it, or they're gonna send it out, or they're gonna submit it, or whatever, or put it in a drawer so nobody ever sees it? How do you figure that what that moment is?
Yeah, it's hard. I'd be hesitant to tell someone. I mean, I could say it seems ready to me, but if it doesn't seem ready to them, I'm like, okay, you're the writer. I think writing, it's like if you really do pay attention to those carnal details, as Mary Carr calls them, those really physical body kinds of details throughout the whole thing, like the kind of stuff I was doing with my cat, like what the sunlight was looking like, and then you'll be planting seeds throughout the time you write it, and some of those seeds will grow and turn into those kinds of motifs. I'm sorry, I keep calling you she. I've forgotten your name.
I'm Rachel.
Rachel, the kind of motifs Rachel was talking about, and some of them will just kind of fizzle out. And then in revision, you'll pull out the fizzlers and kind of try to pull out and enhance and the ones that grow. And then at the end, you'll have a garden. You've made a garden. And a garden has to start with seeds, though, not with like big ideas about what my story is going to be about. That's like trying to transplant a fully grown oak tree into your garden and then put a rose bush next to it and then a tomato plant. I mean, it's just not going to work. Let the seeds grow together. They'll do like a ton of the work for you if you let them. And then you'll see when it's done. It'll have that kind of sense of resolution. But mostly just set it aside for a month or two and then read it again and see if you think it's done.
Is there any kind of process for going through and figuring out which ones are the fizzlers? Because you could, on one hand, you could think, okay, that one fizzled out, it's out. Yeah. Or you could also say, well, that one needs to be grown and it just needs some water and fertilizer to, continue the garden metaphor. How do you know if it's done or if it just needs some attention?
Yeah, I mean, the Fizzlers are just like, you look at it and you're like, well, I thought that was going to be important about my cousin, but I don't know why this is in here now, so I'm taking it out, you know. Yeah, and then the water, when you see something that makes you go, oh, Rachel was saying, you know, that when you turn into the crazy person at the, oh, this connects to this and this connects to this, then you feel excited. That's the stuff to water. But yeah, I mean, writing a book, everybody says they never feel finished, really. I mean, probably some have at some point. But it's nice to have I don't know, just give it some time, put it aside, read it again, say, I fixed some commas, it's done, I'm sending it out. I'm sending it out.
Two other just short questions. I'm going to turn it over to questions from the audience. One is, and this is a question that I've heard a lot, which is, what do you do with the material that might hurt people's feelings or might sort of like cause you family strife or strife with somebody? And, Mary Carr said, you quote her about saying like, they can write their own memoir. That's also easy to say. And then like they read your book and they're like, it gets ugly, or you're worried about getting sued or something. How do you negotiate that, whether it's on the page or in a live story? This is for anybody.
I dealt with that a lot. I was actually told in the beginning by several people that I was going to have to write my story as fiction, because if I wrote about the aviation community and there was anybody who didn't like it, that it'd be like shitting in the nest. I would just be, cast out. And that it was such a sensitive topic that, there's got to be some reason why other military spouses have not written about their experiences much. And in fact, one that has, and very effectively, and I believe her books are downstairs, is Siobhan Fallon, but she does write fiction. So she fictionalizes a lot of the stories. What I eventually found with that was that I couldn't not tell it truly, but then that really, some really tough, bruising, but ultimately very generative conversations came out of that. I had to talk to, excuse me, I had to talk to casualty officers about the process of notifying the family. In final drafts, I reached out to the family of the pilot whose crash I witnessed. I had to figure out a way to talk around the experience of SEER school with my husband, who would not speak about it. And so you find a way to say what's unsayable. So, and oftentimes what that is just reporting your direct witnessed experience. What did he look like when he came back from SEER school? Okay, well, he lost 17 pounds and I could see his ribs. And a lot of that was around, there were two particular words that I could not say about what had happened to him, but I could see the physical evidence of it on his body, two very particular identifiable bruises. And the tension behind that, knowing exactly what it was that I was legally not allowed to say, fueled that entire paragraph. I almost feel like when you run up against those things where like, here's a boundary, it challenges you more, and it almost puts this energy behind it of, all right, watch me, I'm going to do it. But, we're going to have a conversation about it, and you're going to know it's happening, and you can have some input, and, let's talk about how this is going to be okay, because I'm going to do it.
You did a lot of nodding during that, Jonathan.
I mean, just talking about SEER schools. I don't know if everybody here knows what SEER school is. It stands for Survival, Evasion, Reconnaissance, Resistance, and Escape. And it's this very intense program that certain people in the military go through because they are in a position, they're doing a job which exposes them to the possibility that they're going to be captured. They're going to be basically held by enemy forces, and they're going to have to learn how to do all the things that you have to do in that situation and survive it and not tell them what they want to know. So it's a very, very, people don't talk about it, both because they're not supposed to and because it's extremely unpleasant. They make it very, very realistic when they put people through this stuff. So, I mean, that's why I was nodding.
I just want to say quickly that if you think writing fiction, fictionalizing it will get you out of anything. My first book was about two girls whose parents disappear, and their parents are an ornithologist and a swan maiden that he has married. And my dad's first comment to me was, "That is not what our relationship was like, your mother and I." And I'm like, Mom was not a swan maiden, not an ornithologist.
Interesting, Dad.
And then, one last question, and Jonathan and Katherine, this is particularly for you, Jonathan, in terms of putting on a storytelling event, and Katherine, I know that you've done some of this as well. Like, how can people find or prepare themselves to go out and tell stories? Do they just need to find the event and go attend it? Are there any that you would recommend here in town? Or is there a way that they would begin to think telling the story to themselves in order to begin doing it?
I have not actually done that. It looks scary to me. I'd like to try it sometime, but I never have. I've done one-woman shows where I wrote a piece and memorized it and did it, but it wasn't like me. It's different from telling a story. But there are lots of places in town you can do it.
Mm-hmm. There's actually I can't remember the name of the organization, but there's something in Austin, a storytelling organization.
Story Bar is one.
Yeah.
Testify is another.
That's another one? Okay.
Becky, there's a lot. Yeah.
So there are a number of different organizations. I imagine that they put on events, and I imagine they put on workshops as well. I mean, I don't want to do that. I mean, really, honestly, I'm happy to be behind the scenes with these things. I'm not going to get up there and talk about things about me. I'm happy to talk about things about stories, but things about me, no, thank you. But it's a question that we get all the time. Like, how am I going to be able to do this? I think that the thing for us is that we put them up there as a group, and so they're able to support one another. Putting them up there individually, I think, would be a much, much bigger ask.
Hi, I've really enjoyed everything that you all said. It was great. I'm acting as a developmental editor right now and helping people to put their stories out there. And I'm wondering, a lot of people are having to dig way back. They may not remember some inconsequential people's names. How important is it to make sure that every fact is right, or can I just call him Mikey?
I think it's important to do as much due diligence as possible, but I also think rather than jumping immediately to the urge to fictionalize or put a stand-in name, I think it's always interesting to look at the why you don't remember, and even to code that on the page to say, like, I don't remember this person's name, or I can't remember whether the car was blue or green, but I do remember this. There is going to be something that they do remember that's going to seem even weirder. Like, I know for sure he always wore corduroy pants or something like that. To where, yeah, you would think something like a name would be the thing that sticks, but it's often not. It's not how memory works. And I think in that case, it becomes really an interesting part of the story, talking about how memory fails us sometimes, and how it's always necessarily, I mean, in some ways, an act of fiction. It's selective. You go back and you're gathering pieces that you saw through a filter anyway. So I think you kind of have to be honest about it.
Other questions?
I want to ask about the importance of the making sure that you keep coming back to the story thread. Because, are there kind of formulas or shortcuts? And I know you have specific questions that you ask us to ask ourselves about what the primary, us as the primary character, or whoever else it is, what they want, or something like that. But are there other kinds of things like that? Because we have such structure with the hero's journey, and there is structure in doing it another way when there's not necessarily a hero. But I don't know what those ways back are.
I mean, obviously, memoir does, I'm sure you all know this, but memoir does not have to be autobiography, right? Autobiography, you're like, I was born. And then, but memoir, you can have in mind when you go in that I'm focusing on this part of my life as a mother, or my life in my work, or that 1 year I spent in Europe, or whatever. And then it's easier to see the shape of one part of your life than to see the shape of your whole life, I think.
And I don't know if this is this was true for you, Rachel, and I'm not sure if this is necessarily helpful for everyone, but a number of people that we work with will come in with somebody who they are close to, and that person, they will explicitly bring that person in to help them remember. And it's not necessarily because their memory is faulty, but because their memory is limited. And that person can, even just their presence will trigger another perspective in the interviewee's mind as they're thinking about these things. And that's one of the things that we also, will work with people and encourage them to do is, use the people around you to help you with these things. Use them as they can ask you questions that I'm not going to know to ask, but also just their presence in the room when you're thinking about these things, when you're reading them, et cetera, is going to bring up other kinds of things. And that's, I think it doesn't work for everyone, but I think it can be a very powerful memory access, working with other people who are either there or maybe not involved at all, and who have a very objective perspective on what you're talking about or working with.
Maybe one more question, if there is one. Yes.
I think this is the ultimate question. I know it is for me. There's a trade-off between strong emotions and a story that you can tell in pieces and that you want to tell, but you know it's going to hurt someone who's still living. But why do you want to write it? Do you want to write it for your ego? Is there any money in it? I mean, no. All of these things are circular, as in down the drain.
What do you think?
I'm not kidding. There's no money in it. Sorry. No, I think the question's an excellent one. What you really do have to interrogate your motives. Why do you want to tell this? And I think you can even come to several different answers in the process of writing the book. And then once the book is written and it's out there and people are reading it, you come into even further different answers from that. I think for me, it felt, at least initially, like there wasn't a choice not to write it. It wouldn't go away. I couldn't, there was a part at which it was like I couldn't go on to thinking about other things or just move forward unless I had addressed whatever was bothering me about the erasing experience of being a military spouse. But yes, in the process of that, there was a massive amount of risk for everyone involved. I had to go back and tell family stories that were embarrassing and painful and that had been, according to the contract of how you be in my family, they were packed away and done. And so I made a mess there and I pulled it all out. But I do believe in all of that there's a certain code of ethics that you follow, and you don't just get to wreak havoc everywhere in all the systems that you're a part of. For me, for the military community, for aviation, for my marriage, for my family and my family's past, there was an enormous load of back-end lifting that went into having the conversations around that. And it was never an asking permission conversation. It was never like a can I please tell the story conversation. It was, I'm going to tell it. What do we need to talk about? I have questions for you. Are you going to answer them, or is part of the story going to be that we couldn't talk about it? And I think that kind of, as long as you can go into that not armored up, but with the idea of saying, I don't know everything about this story. This is a process of inquiry and exploration for me too. Something's bothering me and I'm trying to fix it. I'm trying to find it. And you enlist the people around you as helping in that. And I think there's a way you can approach it vulnerably, but also, rock solid that you are going to tell your story.
I think that as you were speaking, Rachel, it occurred to me that one of the things that we do when we're scripting is we basically, if somebody is willing to, if they're talking about themselves, no matter what the topic is and who might be implicated. If they're actually talking about themselves, then we're willing to include it. But when they leave that behind and they begin to talk about somebody else in a way that is not, in which they are not centralized, or in which they are trying in some way to mask themselves, we can't include that. It's not necessarily an ethical line for us as much as it's an aesthetic line. But that's where we draw the line, is if they are talking about themselves, then we will consider it. And we'll oftentimes have conversations with them. This is sensitive. Are you sure you want to include this? Is this going to be okay? But if we perceive in it that they are not, that they are in some way trying to shadow themselves, or they're in some way trying to remove themselves while criticizing someone else, or directing some kind of perspective on someone else, then we won't include it. And maybe that's a good way to think about one's own work as well.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think the way that that I tried to keep it in mind was, if I'm going to take a photo of you from not your best angle, then I need to show up like naked in fluorescent light and black socks. Like, I need to, as much as you're going to be embarrassed, I need to do it an order of magnitude more to myself.
Yeah, and that would answer your question about ego, I think. I mean, staying in yourself while you're writing is that's fantastic advice. And then I say, wreak as much havoc as you want while you're writing, or as you need to is maybe a better way to do it. And then go back and edit it if you feel you need to, or maybe, unless you've signed a secrecy clause or something because you're in the military, or then maybe go back and take it out, or don't. Or look at it and go, oh, this is just me trashing him. I'm not really being, honest or vulnerable myself or whatever. But while you're writing, just write. Just stay in yourself, stay in your body, and write. The impulse to write is so precious. Don't let questions about, well, but then my sister, just forget that. She's not there yet.
So the question that we like to end on is just, what are you working on now, or what can we look forward to, your next project? Katherine, what are you working on?
I'm working on my third novel, which I've been working on forever, and other things keep getting in the way. But along with that, I just got a commission to turn my first book, which is like a middle grade, like a book for 12-year-olds, into a play. And I'm very excited about it. It's a very dense book, so I don't quite know how I'm going to turn it into a 1-hour play, but I'm very excited about it.
We produced our 60th play this year in 10 years. So that work is proceeding forward. And I sort of shamefacedly admit, I am working on a memoir. It's just ridiculously painful, and I don't think that it will ever come to anything. It's sort of me scribbling. It's that, like, I'm just scribbling in the dark and reassuring myself that it's going to stay in the dark, and that's okay.
Good job.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's why it's okay to even do it.
That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
No note cards?
Not yet. Not yet. No, I'm still very much in the. Basically, I'm throwing punches in the dark at this point. So.
I'm so glad you admitted that.
Yeah.
It's like privately admitting that, well, and in my spare time, I'm sawing off my leg. It's going great. Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm doing kind of the same thing, but it's more like I tried to take a diversion into a novel, and I was running from it, but the novel died. So I'm definitely in the next memoir, for better or worse.
Please give a warm thank you to our panelists.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org, or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.